In this tutorial, we are considering the ways in which art has been used historically to incite social change. This idea is thoroughly modern, with its foundations being established potentially as far back as the Baroque period, depending on when you want to start advocating for the beginning of the pre-modern period. I personally think the Baroque period is a little bit early to be considered pre-modern, but there are some art historians who think it's so, and they have some convincing arguments that allow me to at least be open-minded to this idea. Now, one thing we've seen pretty much immediately in art history, at least since the Neolithic period, when socioeconomic status and at least some form of pre-institutionalized political leadership becomes a thing, is that art is used to promote dominance. And this is because there's a power in art, in the ways in which it can communicate in these visually immediate emotional ways. And this is not something that's lost on those who commission art. And this is what we're considering here. So you've got these people with these higher positions, and they've relied on art in relatively consistent ways to perpetuate this status quo that has served them well in keeping them in these positions of social, economic, and/or political power. However, with the long-lasting effect of the ideas that were initially introduced by the Enlightenment, we see a rejection of such traditions that marginalize the everyday man or woman. And of course, this is well documented in the history of art. So what we're going to do here is we're going to think about the ways in which art has been used to challenge the status quo. We'll be looking at two works of art which date to two different periods of time and styles to investigate, and here's the important part, how these artists use art to call for change in similar ways, despite differences in time period, context, and style. So we're only looking at similarities here. To look at differences is to be off topic. Now, what we're looking at here is technically two separate works of art, but I think their comparison is instructive to explain what Daumier was trying to do. Now, for your paper, you're limited to only two works of art. And in this tutorial, I'm technically discussing three, but don't worry, I did not go rogue. I asked myself and then gave myself permission to add in this additional piece, First Class Carriage. But first, before we get into Daumier's work, let's start with some context. We're looking at the earliest stirrings of modernism, which is occurring during the time period that Daumier is working in, France in the mid to late 1800s. At this point, Napoleon has been defeated and exiled, which happened in 1815. We see a brief return to the Bourbon monarchy. Then you have a monarch from the Orleans lineage with Louis Philippe. So it's a time of relative political instability with the French Revolution of 1789, then Napoleon, then these two guys, and all of this is within a span of roughly 40-ish years. Louis Philippe was no dum-dum. He did try to placate people by calling himself the citizen king, but actions speak louder than words. He did not heed the lessons of the two previous revolutions, that of 1789 and 1830. So it was a tumultuous time, and to try to really secure control, he, as well as his predecessor, took these really authoritarian approaches to governing. And in a post-revolutionary climate, that's not going over too well. Also, with the rise of journalism during this time, there's a much more open criticism of these problematic rulers and political systems. A particularly significant figure within this was the artist Daumier. And in fact, here's a little fun fact for you. Daumier was jailed for 6 months for creating a particularly scathing caricature that was a critique of Louis Philippe, which reinforces my point about the power of art. Now, let's talk about style. So, while this painting is considered early modernist, more specifically, Daumier is working in the style of realism, which was one of the major movements of early modernism, the other being Impressionism. The point of modernism in art was to address this emergent state of modernity, to explore, and in certain instances such as here, to also interrogate the conditions of modern life. For Daumier, as with many of the realist artists of the time, he was concerned about the impact of industrialization and urbanization. In the case of this painting here, he's looking at how these things impacted class, particularly the working class. For this painting, as well as the other one, First Class Carriage, he's using the public space of the train, which was an emblem itself of modernity. And he's using this space to show the ways in which industrialization has contributed to an inequitable distribution of resources that functions to marginalize a large section of French society, and to comment on how these sorts of spaces also reinforce social hierarchy. In this painting, Daumier depicts a darkened interior of a third-class railway car. We've got a tight compositional space full of people, it's phobia, where we feel as uncomfortable as those who must ride in this class. The color choices are significant. First of all, it's really dark, right? It's really hard to see, and that darkness kind of reinforces that sense of being closed in and being claustrophobic. In addition, though, to the darkness, he's using this sort of yellowish tone that to me seems to suggest stale air. This carriage feels very hot and stuffy. And then you've got the browns that make this space feel dirty or grungy. The women in the foreground appear tired and sad, and they're rather up close to the front of the picture plane. That close proximity to the viewer makes it hard for us to really avoid these people, to look beyond them. Their depiction is rather rough, and it's not rough to mock them or to present them in an unflattering manner, but instead it's really to suggest the challenges of poverty. In the typical realist approach, we have everyday people in an everyday situation, communicated in an honest, unemotional way. But just because this is unemotional does not mean that Daumier is completely detached. Despite being crammed into a claustrophobic, dirty rail car, there's still this quiet, serene dignity to these people. You've got this golden light, which could almost have a religious connotation. And I'm saying that because I'm noticing here the positioning of the hands that rest on the basket, which to me suspiciously look like praying hands, right? And then you have here this woman who's in the process, it looks like of breastfeeding maybe, or at least indicative of that act, to indicate this idea of family and motherhood. So these people seen are humble, they're authentic, they're the salt of the earth, they're good people, they're moral, they're religiously devout. Now in this comparison, it's very clear, even more so, what Daumier is trying to say. Because in the first class carriage, you get much more of a feeling of open space. There are only 4 people in first class in contrast to this crowd of the third class. The first class figures are well dressed, they're seated comfortably. There's no sense here of being exhausted or sad. We also see these indications of education and literacy, which is something that's still not accessible to all people during this time period. And that's evidenced with the woman here who's reading the paper. To me, this also speaks of a leisure activity, which we know can also be connected to conceptions of economic privilege. While these two paintings certainly function as socio-political commentary, Daumier is not trying to disparage the upper class. They're not presented to us in a negative fashion. The critique seems more to be placed on the system that creates the economic division that is represented here. Now let's keep with the same structure and start again with style and context. So we're still looking at modern art here, but the style designation and certainly the context is different. We don't have a more specific style name here, at least not with this work. Not like Daumier's work, which is modern, but we can more specifically label it as realism. This work is simply just considered late modernist. In the later years of the 20th century, what we're doing is we're looking at post-World War II societies. Those societies that are left with the after effect of one of the most devastating events in all of human history, an event that brought about a destruction that people felt on all scales, economically, psychologically, socially, culturally, physically, and by that I'm referring to not only a high death toll, but a widespread destruction of landscape as well. Now, understandably, this led to a focus on power. Some artists wanted to investigate the modern experience as a means to uncover the dynamics of power that were responsible for things such as a world war. And they wanted to actively work to change the balance of power, to advocate for something more equitable, and to doing that through social change. Now, the date of the Homeless Vehicle Project, the late 80s, is significant because it places this work on the doorstep of postmodernism, which I locate within the 1990s, although there's some art historians, I'm sure, who would place this date earlier. Postmodernism has been read as a reaction against modernism. Modernism was based on realism, rationalism, experimentation, and aesthetic simplicity, which many postmodern artists critiqued as being detached. Instead, postmodern artists were skeptical of reason and instead sought to create complex works of art that have multiple meanings. The reason why I see Wodiczko's work as being significant in terms of chronology is I see it as transitional, that it has some of these features of modernism, but it's definitely presaging a lot of these ideas that postmodernists will be investigating as well. The artist of these vehicles that we're seeing in this slide and in the previous creates art as a way to confront contemporary society with its own ills. Much of his work deals with homelessness and calling attention to it, for he feels that the majority of us live among the homeless, yet don't adequately acknowledge their experiences, that we're indifferent to their plights and do not question what actually causes homelessness. For Wodiczko, it was more instructive to take a look at the system, not to just simply blame the individuals. For example, he cited in terms of the problem with homelessness the lack of government programs that supported mental illness. He also cited reduced funding for welfare, or what he called urbicide, which was the gentrification of urban spaces that took away affordable housing. And I think it's this last point especially that makes this particular photograph so interesting. It's a sort of point of comparison comparable to our Daumier comparison. You've got homelessness, our homeless individual, the vehicle here, and this is set against the gold facade of the Trump Tower. This gold facade is this vision of opulence. And keep in mind that Trump became very, very rich off notorious and speculative real estate dealings. So with these vehicles, what Wodiczko wanted to do was he wanted to create something that would alleviate the condition of homelessness, but at the same time make homeless people visible, to show people the way that the homeless worked and lived, and to show the realities of one who lived without a home. So to make these homeless vehicles, the artist collaborated with homeless people, and he asked them what would they need and what would they like in such a contraption. And then he created a vehicle that was based off of the shopping cart, which had multiple functions, which you can see here in these diagrams. It can transport a small number of belongings, and these belongings can be secured so that they cannot be stolen. It had a place to store recyclables, which many would do that as a way to earn money. And it could also act as a mobile and very simple form of shelter that they could sleep in, which you're seeing here and down in here as well. So now it's time to sort of bring all of this together, right? We're looking at two works that differ in terms of media. One's a painting, one's a constructed sculpture. They differ in terms of time period, early modernism versus late modernism. But we have a similar approach in critiquing the unequal distribution of wealth created into industrialized societies. Both works of art frame this within the dialogue of public space, particularly as it relates to modes of transportation. And this notion of the public is important because it relates to this idea of invisibility. Then and now, poverty is something that remains relatively invisible. And in many ways, this is deliberate. If it's invisible, people are not really going to be questioning a status quo where the economic system benefits a select few to the detriment of a great many. In both cases, we have an attempt on the part of the artist to humanize people of lower socioeconomic status, where now Poverty and homelessness are not abstract concepts, but we see the ways in which it affects real people.